Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. 15 years of driving long haul and I thought I'd seen it all. 41 years old, divorced, no kids, just me and the road most days. The pay's decent enough and I've gotten used to sleeping in different places every night. Truck stops, motels, sometimes even the cab when I'm between loads. Last month I was doing a run from Portland down to Sacramento, one of those routes where the timing's tight and you can't afford to waste hours parking. Usually I'd just crash at a Flying J, but this particular stretch had me hitting Eugene right around midnight. And honestly, I was beat. Driving in the rain for 8 hours straight will do that to anyone. The wipers had been squeaking the whole time, and my neck was stiff from hunching forward trying to see through the downpour. Instead of my usual truck stop routine, I decided to try something different. Found this Airbnb listing for a guest room attached to some family's house. Figured it'd be nice to have a real bed and maybe a shower that didn't require quarters. The listing appeared clean enough, good reviews, and the host seemed responsive when I messaged about late check-in. Place was in a quiet residential neighborhood, one of those older Eugene areas with big trees and houses that had been there since the 70s. The main house was a 2-story colonial with blue siding, and the guest room was this little addition off the back with its own separate entrance. Perfect for what I needed, just a place to crash for the night and get back on the road early. The host was a woman named Linda, probably in her 50s, with graying hair pulled back in a loose bun and paint-stained fingers. She met me at the main door when I arrived, apologizing for the late hour and explaining that she was an artist who kept odd hours anyway. The family seemed normal enough. I could hear a TV playing softly inside, and there were kids' bikes scattered on the front porch. Linda walked me around to the guest room entrance, chatting about the neighborhood and how they'd converted the space a few years back when her teenage son moved out. The room itself was clean and simple. Queen bed, small dresser, tiny bathroom with a shower that actually had decent water pressure. She handed me a single key attached to a wooden keychain shaped like a miniature paintbrush, which made me smile. What struck me as odd was how she lingered at the door after showing me around. Linda kept glancing at the lock mechanism, running her fingers along the doorframe like she was checking for something. When I asked if everything was all right, she just laughed it off, saying she was always paranoid about security since they'd had some break-ins in the neighborhood recently. She mentioned that no one else had access to the room, not her husband, not her kids, just her and now me. The way she emphasized it seemed strange at the time, but I figured she was just being thorough. After she left, I noticed she walked back to the main house but kept turning around to glance at my door, which struck me as unusual behavior for a host. I settled in for the night, grateful for the comfortable bed and the quiet atmosphere. The room had this cozy feeling to it, with warm lighting and the faint smell of vanilla from a candle that had been burning recently. I took a long shower, ordered some takeout from a nearby Thai place, and spent the evening watching Netflix on my phone. By around 10 p.m., I was ready to call it a night since I needed to be back on the road by 6 a.m. The neighborhood was peaceful, just the occasional car passing by and the distant hum of the highway. I double-checked that the door was locked, set my alarm, and settled under the covers with my phone charging on the nightstand beside me. The first night passed without incident, and I woke up feeling more rested than I had in weeks. Linda was already up when I left, tending to some flowers in her front yard. She waved goodbye and asked if I'd slept well, which I had. The whole experience was so pleasant that when I found myself with the same route 2 weeks later, I booked the same room again. Linda seemed pleased to have a returning guest, and this time the check-in process was even smoother. She barely walked me to the door, just handed me the same paintbrush keychain, and reminded me that I was the only one with access to the room. The familiarity of the space was comforting. Everything exactly as I'd left it, down to the position of the bedside lamp. It was around 3 a.m. when I woke up to the sound of metal against metal. At first, I thought it was part of a dream, but then I heard it again, a soft scraping, like someone was fumbling with something metallic. My eyes adjusted to the darkness and I lay there listening, trying to figure out what was making the noise. The sound was coming from the direction of the door, rhythmic and deliberate. Then I heard the unmistakable sound of a key sliding into a lock, followed by the slow, careful turn of the doorknob. My heart started pounding as I realized someone was trying to get into my room. The door opened maybe an inch before whoever was on the other side seemed to pause, then slowly pulled it closed again. I heard footsteps retreating across the gravel outside. I stayed perfectly still for what felt like forever, listening for any other sounds. The silence was deafening after what had just happened. Part of me wondered if I'd imagined the whole thing, but the adrenaline coursing through my veins told me otherwise. After about 20 minutes, I worked up the courage to get out of bed and check the door. The lock was still engaged, but when I examined it closely with my phone's flashlight, I could see faint scratch marks around the keyhole that definitely hadn't been there before. The metal looked freshly scraped, with tiny metal shavings scattered on the floor beneath the lock. Someone had definitely been trying to get in, and they'd had a key, or at least something that worked like one. The next morning, I confronted Linda about what had happened. She was in her kitchen when I knocked on the main house door, wearing a paint-splattered apron and holding a cup of coffee. When I described the incident, her face went pale and she started shaking her head vigorously. She insisted that absolutely no one else had access to the guest room, not her husband Tom, not her 2 teenage kids, not even her elderly mother who lived with them. Linda seemed genuinely shocked and concerned, asking if I wanted her to call the police. She walked around the property with me, checking for signs of forced entry or any indication that someone had been lurking around. We found nothing unusual, just the scratch marks I'd already discovered. What bothered me most was how Linda kept insisting that there was only one key to that room, the one she'd given me. But the evidence was right there in front of us. Someone had used a key to unlock that door. When I pressed her about whether she might have made a spare key at some point, she became defensive, almost angry. She claimed that she'd never had a duplicate made, that the original key was the only one that existed. The whole conversation left me unsettled, especially when she suggested that maybe I'd been having a particularly vivid dream. The way she dismissed my concerns, combined with her strange behavior during my first stay, made me wonder if she was being completely honest with me about the key situation. Despite my reservations, I decided to stay one more night since I had already paid for 2 nights and my schedule was tight. But this time, I wasn't taking any chances. I set my phone up on the dresser with the camera facing the door and started recording before I went to bed. The motion-activated nightlight near the entrance was positioned perfectly to illuminate anyone who might try to enter. I also pushed the dresser slightly in front of the door, not enough to block it completely, but enough that I'd hear if someone tried to force their way in. Sleep came fitfully, and I found myself waking up every hour or so, checking the time and listening for any unusual sounds outside. When I woke up the next morning and checked the recording, my heart nearly stopped. There, clear as day on the footage, was the door opening slowly around 2:47 a.m. The nightlight flickered on, illuminating a pale hand reaching through the gap, fingers extended toward my duffel bag which I'd left on the floor near the foot of the bed. The hand moved with deliberate precision, as if whoever was attached to it knew exactly where my belongings were. But the moment the motion light activated, the hand jerked back like it had been burned. The door quietly closed and I could hear the faint sound of footsteps retreating. I played the footage back 3 times, zooming in on the hand, but couldn't make out any identifying features, just that unnaturally pale skin and long, thin fingers that seemed to move with an almost spider-like quality. I didn't even bother talking to Linda again. Instead, I packed my stuff and drove straight to the Eugene Police Department. The officer who took my report was a middle-aged guy named Detective Williams, who actually seemed to take the whole thing seriously. When I showed him the video footage, his expression changed completely. He asked me to forward the file to his email and took down all the details about the property and the hosts. What he told me next made my skin crawl. Apparently, they'd received 2 other similar reports about that same address in the past 6 months. Other guests had reported feeling like someone was watching them or hearing noises outside their door, but none had managed to capture evidence like I had. Detective Williams explained that they'd been trying to build a case, but needed concrete proof. My video footage was exactly what they needed to get a search warrant. 3 days later, he called me with an update that still gives me chills. They'd found a hidden compartment in the main house filled with duplicate keys for not just the guest room, but several other Airbnb properties around Eugene. Turns out Linda's teenage son had been making copies of guest room keys and selling access to local thieves who would wait for travelers to fall asleep before attempting to rob them. The pale hand in my video belonged to a 19-year-old named Kyle, Linda's nephew, who'd been staying with the family temporarily. Linda claimed she had no idea what was happening, but Detective Williams said they found evidence suggesting she was at least partially aware of the scheme. The whole operation got shut down immediately, and Linda's Airbnb listing was permanently removed from the platform. Kyle and 2 other guys were arrested and charged with attempted burglary and conspiracy. Linda faced charges for running an illegal operation and endangering guests. Detective Williams told me that my video evidence was crucial in getting convictions for all of them. I never did find out exactly how long they'd been doing this, or how many other travelers had been targeted without knowing it. What haunts me most is thinking about all those nights I could have been robbed or worse, and I would never have known someone was inches away from my sleeping body. I stick to truck stops now, at least there. The only thing trying to get into my cab is the occasional raccoon. I travel constantly for my job in pharmaceutical sales, conferences, client meetings, the whole 9 yards. Most of the time, the company books decent hotels, but this particular Chicago trip was a nightmare. Everything got arranged last minute because our usual contact screwed up, and with some massive medical convention in town, hotels were either booked solid or charging ridiculous rates. That's how I ended up on Airbnb for the first time, scrolling through listings at midnight trying to find something that wouldn't break the budget. The place I found was a 1-bedroom apartment in Lincoln Park, 3rd floor of this old brownstone that had probably seen better days. The host, Janet, seemed friendly enough in our messages, mentioning she'd just finished renovating and I'd be her very first guest. The apartment had that vintage Chicago charm, exposed brick, creaky hardwood floors, and these enormous windows that made the whole place feel bigger than it actually was. Janet had left this sweet welcome basket with local coffee and some fancy chocolates, which honestly made me feel a little guilty about how cheap the nightly rate was. The bedroom closet was one of those deep, old-fashioned walk-ins with built-in shelves that must have been original to the building. I remember unpacking my suitcase and being impressed by how much storage space there was. Way more than any hotel room I'd ever stayed in. The whole place felt like stepping into someone's grandmother's house, complete with the faint smell of lavender sachets and old wood polish. The first couple of days went perfectly. I had my usual routine, morning coffee at the little kitchen table, reviewing client files, then heading out to meetings across the city. The apartment was peaceful, and I actually started to prefer it to hotels. No noisy hallways, no key cards that never worked, no overpriced room service. I'd come back each evening, kick off my heels, and actually relax for the first time in months. Janet had stocked the fridge with basics, and I picked up some groceries to make simple dinners. The quiet was exactly what I needed after dealing with demanding doctors and hospital administrators all day. Even the neighbor's cat, this orange tabby that liked to sit on the fire escape outside my window, became a comforting presence. The weirdness started on Thursday morning. I'm pretty organized, have to be in my line of work, and I always put my laptop charger in the same spot on the nightstand before bed. But when I woke up, it was plugged into the wall outlet near the dresser instead. I stared at it for a full minute, trying to remember if I'd moved it, but I was certain I hadn't. The memory was clear. I'd placed it on the nightstand, coiled the cord the way I always do, and plugged my phone in next to it. I chalked it up to being tired from the crazy week. Maybe I'd moved it half asleep and forgotten. But there was this nagging feeling in the back of my mind that wouldn't go away. I'd traveled enough to know my own habits, and moving the charger just wasn't something I'd do automatically. Then it was my toiletries. I keep them arranged in a specific order on the bathroom counter. Face wash, moisturizer, toothbrush, contact solution. Same setup every single time. Friday morning, the face wash was behind the moisturizer instead of in front. Small thing, right? But it bothered me way more than it should have. I stood there brushing my teeth, staring at those bottles and trying to convince myself I was just being paranoid. The stress of the trip, the unfamiliar environment, maybe I was just overthinking everything. But deep down, I knew my routine. I'd been doing the same travel setup for years. You don't just randomly rearrange your stuff when you're half asleep. The real kicker came that evening when I got back from my last client meeting. I was exhausted, ready to order takeout and collapse on the couch with some mindless Netflix. I went to throw away the business cards I'd collected during the day. You know how it is. Everyone hands you their card whether you want it or not. But when I lifted the lid of the small trash can in the kitchen, there was a crumpled up granola bar wrapper sitting right on top. A brand I'd never seen before. Some organic hemp and quinoa thing that looked like it cost more than my lunch. I definitely hadn't eaten it. Hell, I hadn't even been to a grocery store that would sell something that pretentious. I picked it up, examined it like it was evidence in a crime scene, reading every ingredient twice. That's when the rational part of my brain started fighting with the paranoid part. Maybe Janet had forgotten to empty the trash before I arrived. But no, I'd thrown stuff away every day, and the can had been empty when I first got there. Maybe she'd come by to check on something while I was out, but she hadn't mentioned anything about stopping by, and I hadn't given her any reason to. The wrapper was definitely fresh, still had that oily residue on it, not dried out like something that had been sitting there for days. I held it up to the light, studying the creases, trying to figure out when the hell someone could have eaten this thing in my temporary home. I decided to test my theory the next morning. Before leaving for my final meeting, I arranged everything with deliberate precision. I placed a pen at a specific angle on the coffee table, positioned my coffee mug handle facing exactly northeast, and left a book open to page 247 with my bookmark sticking out precisely half an inch. I even took photos with my phone, feeling ridiculous but determined to prove to myself that I was either losing my mind or something genuinely weird was happening. The apartment felt different as I stood there in my heels and blazer, like it was watching me set up my little experiment. Even the orange tabby on the fire escape seemed to be staring at me with more intensity than usual. When I returned 3 hours later, my heart was pounding before I even got the key in the lock. The pen had been moved, rotated about 30 degrees counterclockwise. The mug handle now pointed southeast, and the bookmark was sticking out a full inch, not the careful half-inch I'd left it. But what really made my pulse race was the book itself. It was now open to page 251, 4 pages further than where I'd left it. Someone had been here, in my space, touching my things, and apparently had time to sit down and read while I was gone. The photos on my phone confirmed everything. This wasn't my imagination playing tricks on me. Someone was definitely in this apartment when I wasn't here. I stood in the living room, clutching my phone, trying to process what this meant. Janet had keys, obviously, but why would she come in and move my stuff around? And why lie about it? Maybe she was some kind of control freak who couldn't handle guests rearranging her space. But that didn't explain the granola bar wrapper or the subtle way things had been moved the previous days. This felt intentional, like someone was trying to mess with my head without being obvious about it. I started walking through the apartment, really looking at everything for the first time. The closet in the bedroom suddenly seemed more ominous, with its deep shadows and old wooden shelves. I'd been hanging my clothes in there for days without really exploring the back corners. That's when I noticed the scratches on the hardwood floor inside the closet. Fresh scratches like something heavy had been dragged across the wood recently. They led from the middle of the closet straight to the back wall, where the shadows were deepest. I got down on my hands and knees, using my phone's flashlight to illuminate the far corner. The back wall wasn't flush with the others. There was a gap, maybe 6 inches wide, hidden behind a section of the built-in shelving. The wood paneling looked newer there, different from the rest of the aged walls. My heart was hammering as I pressed against the panel, and it moved slightly, like it wasn't completely secured. I pushed harder, and with a soft creak, a section of the wall swung inward on hidden hinges. Behind it was a narrow crawl space that extended back into the darkness between the apartment walls. The smell hit me immediately: unwashed clothes, stale food, and something else I couldn't identify. Using my phone light, I could see a sleeping bag crumpled in the corner, along with empty food containers, water bottles, and what looked like a small camping lantern. There were books scattered around, the same titles I'd seen on Janet's shelves in the living room. But the most disturbing thing was the notebook lying open near the sleeping bag. In cramped handwriting, someone had been documenting my daily routine. She leaves at 8:30 a.m. Coffee first, always checks phone twice. Comes back around 6 p.m. Showers at night, sleeps with the bedroom door closed. The entries went back to the day I'd arrived. Someone had been watching me, learning my habits, living just feet away from where I slept. I backed out of the crawl space so fast I knocked over my suitcase. Every nerve in my body was screaming at me to get out, but I also knew I had to do something. I couldn't just leave and let this person continue living in there, potentially terrorizing the next guest. I grabbed my things, threw them in my bag without folding anything, and got out of that apartment in less than 10 minutes. From the safety of my rental car, I called the police. When they arrived, I watched from across the street as they pulled a thin, bearded man out of the crawl space. He was probably in his 40s, wearing the same clothes he'd apparently been living in for weeks. The officers later told me he'd been staying there for over a month, entering and leaving through a loose window in the building's basement that connected to the crawlspace system. Turns out Janet had no idea. She'd inherited the building from her grandmother and had renovated the apartment herself, never knowing about the hidden access point behind the closet. The man had been squatting in various parts of the old building for months, but had gotten bolder once he realized someone was actually staying in the apartment. He'd been surviving on food deliveries he'd intercept and whatever he could scavenge, only venturing out when he was certain I wasn't there. The police charged him with trespassing and stalking, and Janet was horrified when she learned what had happened. She immediately hired contractors to seal up all the crawl spaces and old access points throughout the building. I still get chills thinking about how many nights I slept just a few feet away from someone who was watching my every move, cataloging my habits like I was some kind of lab rat in his personal experiment. Me and my best friend Jessica had been planning this Austin trip for months. We're both theater kids from Dallas, always looking for new comedy shows to catch, and we'd heard amazing things about this underground improv scene happening in some dive bar on East 6th Street. Jessica had just gotten out of a messy breakup with her college boyfriend, and I'd been dealing with my own drama at work, so we figured a weekend getaway would be perfect timing. We booked this cute little Airbnb in a quiet residential neighborhood about 15 minutes from downtown. One of those classic Austin bungalows with a wraparound porch and those massive oak trees everywhere. The photos online made it look like the perfect place to unwind, and the host, this sweet older lady named Beverly, had left us a whole basket of local coffee and breakfast tacos in the fridge. The house sat on this tree-lined street, where all the homes looked like they'd been there since the 1940s, with their original hardwood floors and vintage tile work that you just don't see anymore. The comedy show that Friday night was absolutely incredible. We laughed until our sides hurt, especially during this one bit where the comedian was riffing about dating apps and kept pulling audience members into the act. Jessica even got called up on stage at one point, and she was such a good sport about it that the whole crowd was cheering for her. We grabbed some late-night tacos afterward from this food truck that the locals recommended, and by the time we made it back to the Airbnb, it was well past midnight. The neighborhood was completely silent except for the occasional car passing by and this gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze. We were both exhausted but still buzzing from the show, so we decided to make some tea and sit out on the front porch for a bit, just talking and enjoying the cool night air. The street was dimly lit by these old-fashioned lampposts that cast these long shadows across the sidewalk, and there were maybe 6 or 7 cars parked along the curb, which seemed normal for a residential area. Everything about that moment felt so peaceful and perfect. Just 2 friends sharing stories under a sky full of stars, with the faint smell of jasmine drifting from someone's garden nearby. We eventually headed inside around 1:30 a.m., both of us ready to crash after such a long day. The Airbnb had this charming layout where the master bedroom was at the front of the house, and there was a smaller guest room toward the back near the bathroom. Jessica took the master since she'd been the one to book the place, and I settled into the cozy guest room with its vintage wallpaper and this antique dresser that probably weighed more than my car. The bathroom was right next to my room, with this old-fashioned window that looked out onto the backyard. One of those frosted glass windows that you could push open for ventilation, but couldn't really see through clearly. I remember brushing my teeth and noticing how quiet everything was, like the whole world had gone to sleep except for us. The floorboards creaked a little when you walked on them, which just added to the house's character, and I could hear Jessica moving around in her room, probably doing her usual nighttime routine of checking her phone and setting 17 different alarms. I must have fallen asleep pretty quickly because the next thing I knew, I was jolted awake by this strange tapping sound. At first I thought maybe it was just the old house settling or a tree branch hitting the roof, but then I heard it again. Tap, 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 very deliberate and rhythmic. I glanced at my phone, 3:47 a.m. The tapping seemed to be coming from the bathroom, so I got up and padded across the cold hardwood floor to investigate. The sound was definitely coming from the window, like someone was gently tapping on the glass from outside. My heart started racing a little because who would be tapping on a bathroom window at almost 4 in the morning? I stood there in the doorway, listening intently, and the tapping continued. Not aggressive or frantic, but steady and purposeful, like someone was trying to get attention without making too much noise. The frosted glass made it impossible to see anything clearly, just vague shadows and shapes that could have been anything. I wanted to call out to Jessica, but part of me was worried I was just being paranoid and didn't want to wake her up over nothing. The tapping stopped for about 30 seconds, and I almost convinced myself I'd imagined the whole thing. Then it started again, this time with a slightly different rhythm. 3 quick taps, pause, 3 quick taps, pause. It was like someone was using a code or trying to establish a pattern. My mouth went dry, and I could feel my pulse quickening as I realized this wasn't random at all. Someone was definitely out there, deliberately tapping on our bathroom window in the middle of the night. I crept closer to the window, trying to stay as quiet as possible, and pressed my ear against the wall next to it. The tapping was coming from about chest height, which meant whoever was out there was standing right outside, probably just a few feet away from where I was standing. The thought made my skin crawl. There was literally just a thin pane of glass and maybe 3 feet of space between me and this unknown person. I could hear the faint sound of breathing, or maybe shuffling footsteps on the other side, and every instinct in my body was screaming at me to get away from that window. But I was also frozen with curiosity and fear, unable to move or look away. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore and decided to wake Jessica up. I tiptoed to her room and gently shook her shoulder, whispering her name until she stirred. She was always a deep sleeper, so it took a few tries before she opened her eyes and looked at me with that confused expression people get when they're woken up suddenly. "There's someone outside the bathroom window," I whispered as quietly as I could. "They keep tapping on the glass." Jessica sat up immediately, all traces of sleepiness disappearing from her face. We both listened in silence for a moment, and sure enough, the tapping started again, that same deliberate pattern. Her eyes widened, and she grabbed her phone from the nightstand. "Should we call the police?" she whispered back. We both knew this wasn't normal behavior, and the fact that whoever was out there had been persistent enough to keep tapping for several minutes made it clear they weren't just going to go away. The whole situation felt surreal, like we were characters in some horror movie, except this was really happening, and we were alone in a strange house in a city we barely knew. We decided to call 911, but as Jessica was dialing, the tapping suddenly stopped. We waited in complete silence for what felt like forever, both of us holding our breath and straining to hear any sound from outside. After about 10 minutes of nothing, Jessica hung up, and we debated whether we should still call the police or if maybe whoever it was had finally given up and left. We spent the rest of the night huddled together in her room, taking turns keeping watch by peeking through the front window blinds to see if we could spot anyone suspicious. The street looked exactly the same as it had when we'd come home earlier. Those same cars parked along the curb, the same dim lighting from the lampposts, everything perfectly normal and quiet. But now every shadow seemed threatening. Every rustling leaf made us jump. We barely slept, and when the sun finally came up around 7 a.m., we both felt exhausted and on edge. Jessica made coffee with shaky hands while I called Beverly, our host, to let her know what had happened. She was shocked and immediately offered to come over, insisting that nothing like this had ever happened before. When Beverly arrived about an hour later, she was this tiny, energetic woman in her 60s with silver hair and the kind of warm smile that immediately puts you at ease. She walked around the entire property with us, checking all the windows and doors, and when we got to the bathroom window, she pointed out something we hadn't noticed in the dark. There were scuff marks in the dirt beneath the window, like someone had been standing there for an extended period of time. The flower bed was also trampled, with several of Beverly's carefully planted marigolds completely flattened. "This is definitely not normal," she said, taking photos with her phone. "I'm calling the police right now." While we waited for the officers to arrive, Beverly made us breakfast and kept apologizing profusely, as if somehow this was her fault. She mentioned that the neighborhood was usually so safe that most people didn't even lock their doors at night, and that she'd been hosting on Airbnb for 3 years without a single incident. The fact that someone had specifically targeted our house on the one night we happened to be staying there made the whole thing feel even more unsettling and personal. 2 police officers arrived around 10 a.m. Officer Martinez, a tall Hispanic man with kind eyes, and Officer Thompson, a younger woman with short blonde hair who immediately started taking detailed notes. They examined the bathroom window area thoroughly, taking photos of the scuff marks and trampled flowers that Beverly had discovered. Officer Martinez asked us to walk them through exactly what had happened, and as we recounted the story, I could see both officers taking it very seriously. They asked specific questions about the timing, the pattern of the tapping, and whether we'd noticed anyone following us or acting strangely during our time in Austin. When we mentioned that we'd been out at the comedy show and grabbed food afterward, Officer Thompson asked for the exact locations and times, writing everything down in her notepad. Then Officer Martinez asked us something that made my heart skip a beat. "Did you notice a dark blue sedan parked on this street when you came home last night?" We both looked at each other and nodded. There had been several cars parked along the curb, and one of them was definitely a dark blue sedan, maybe about 4 or 5 houses down from where we were staying. Officer Thompson radioed something to dispatch, and within minutes, they told us they'd found the vehicle. It was still parked in the same spot, which meant whoever had been tapping on our window had likely returned to their car and spent the rest of the night watching the house. The officers asked us to stay inside while they approached the vehicle, and we watched from the front window as they walked down the street. The car appeared to be empty, but Officer Martinez was shining his flashlight through the windows, while Officer Thompson wrote down the license plate number. After about 10 minutes, they came back to the house with a plastic evidence bag containing what looked like a pair of binoculars and a small digital camera. "We found these on the front seat," Officer Martinez explained, his expression grave. "The camera has photos on it, and we're going to need to process it as evidence." The reality of what he was saying hit me like a truck. Someone had been watching us, taking pictures of us, and we had no idea how long this had been going on or what their intentions were. Officer Thompson returned about an hour later with news that made my skin crawl. The camera contained dozens of photos, including several of Jessica and me at the coffee shop we'd visited yesterday morning before the comedy show. There were pictures of us sitting at our outdoor table, laughing and talking, completely oblivious to the fact that someone was photographing us from across the street. The photos had timestamps showing they were taken around 11:30 a.m., which meant this person had been following us for nearly an entire day before the incident at the house. "We've identified the vehicle owner," Officer Thompson said, consulting her notes. "His name is Gregory Walsh, 34 years old, and he has a history of stalking charges in San Antonio. We've issued a warrant for his arrest." The officers explained that Walsh had apparently been driving around Austin targeting young women, particularly those staying in short-term rentals like Airbnb properties. They suspected he'd been monitoring rental listings and selecting victims based on their photos and travel plans. The systematic nature of his behavior was terrifying. This wasn't some random creep, but someone who had developed an entire method for stalking unsuspecting tourists. By early afternoon, the police had arrested Walsh at his apartment complex on the south side of town. They found additional cameras, more photos of other women, and detailed notes about various rental properties around the city. Officer Martinez called us personally to let us know he was in custody and that we were safe. The whole experience left Jessica and me shaken for months afterward. We kept thinking about how close we'd come to something potentially much worse, and how we'd been completely unaware that we were being watched and followed. We ended up cutting our Austin trip short and driving back to Dallas that same day, both of us too rattled to enjoy the rest of our weekend. Even now, years later, I'm hyper-aware of my surroundings when I travel, always checking for cars that might be following me or people who seem to be paying too much attention. That night taught me that danger can lurk in the most unexpected places, and that sometimes the only thing standing between you and a really bad situation is a thin piece of glass and the courage to trust your instincts when something doesn't feel right. What happened to me and my girlfriend Ashley at that cabin in the Smoky Mountains last month has left me questioning everything about trust and human nature. We're both 28, been together for 3 years, and we'd been planning this romantic getaway for months after a particularly brutal stretch at our jobs. I work as a graphic designer for a small marketing firm in Nashville, pulling long hours on demanding client projects, while Ashley teaches 3rd grade and deals with helicopter parents daily. We desperately needed to disconnect from the chaos of our daily lives. When we stumbled across this cozy cabin listing for what seemed like an impossible price, only $89 a night, we couldn't believe our luck. The photos showed a rustic log cabin with a wraparound porch, surrounded by towering pines and misty mountain views that promised the perfect escape from city life. The hosts, Robert and Helen Carpenter, had accumulated dozens of glowing 5-star reviews praising their warm hospitality and the peaceful atmosphere of their property. The drive up to the cabin took us through winding mountain roads that seemed to stretch endlessly into the wilderness. Ashley was handling navigation while I gripped the steering wheel of our Toyota Camry, and we kept losing cell service every few miles as we climbed higher into the mountains. The further we drove from civilization, the more isolated we became, passing only a handful of other vehicles and the occasional weathered farmhouse tucked between dense clusters of pine trees. When we finally reached the turnoff mentioned in our host's directions, we found ourselves on a narrow gravel road that snaked through thick forest for another 10 minutes. The cabin appeared suddenly through a break in the trees, and it was even more picturesque than the photos had suggested. Robert and Helen were waiting on the front porch as we pulled up, waving enthusiastically with bright smiles that seemed genuine enough. Robert was a tall, lean man in his early 60s with silver hair and calloused hands, while Helen appeared to be in her late 50s with graying blonde hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. They both wore matching flannel shirts, and seemed like the stereotypical friendly mountain folk we'd hoped to encounter. The introductions went smoothly at first, with Robert helping us carry our bags while Helen offered us mason jars filled with what she called mountain sweet tea that tasted like it had been brewing in the sun all day. They gave us a tour of the cabin, pointing out the wood-burning stove, the fully stocked kitchen, and the hot tub on the back deck that overlooked a small creek. Robert mentioned that they lived in a smaller cabin about 100 yards uphill from ours, just visible through the trees if you knew where to look. Helen kept touching Ashley's arm while they talked, complimenting her hair and asking detailed questions about our relationship, how long we'd been together, whether we were planning to get married, if we attended church regularly. The questions felt invasive, but Ashley just smiled politely and answered while I focused on getting our stuff settled. When Helen asked about our families and whether we were right with the Lord, Ashley shot me a glance that I recognized as her "help me out here" look. Robert seemed to pick up on the awkwardness and suggested they leave us to get comfortable, but not before Helen pressed a small basket of homemade cookies into Ashley's hands. After they left, Ashley and I exchanged looks and burst into nervous laughter. "Well, they're certainly friendly," Ashley said, setting the cookie basket on the kitchen counter. The cookies were shaped like little crosses and had Bible verses written on them in frosting, John 3:16 and Psalm 23:4, in shaky handwriting. We decided to ignore the religious overtones and focus on enjoying our vacation. The cabin was genuinely beautiful inside, with exposed wooden beams, a stone fireplace, and large windows that let in the golden afternoon light filtering through the pine trees. We spent the rest of the evening cooking dinner together, sharing a bottle of wine we'd brought, and planning our hiking route for the next day. By the time we settled into bed around 11, we were both feeling relaxed and optimistic about the next few days. The bed was comfortable, the mountain air was crisp and clean, and we could hear the gentle sound of the creek babbling behind the cabin. Everything seemed perfect as we drifted off to sleep, completely unaware of what we would discover the next morning. The next day started innocently enough. Ashley woke up before me and was already making coffee when I stumbled out of bed around 8. She mentioned that she'd dropped her phone charger somewhere and was going to look under the bed for it. I was brushing my teeth when I heard her call my name in a strange, tight voice that made me rush back to the bedroom. She was kneeling beside the bed, holding a crumpled piece of paper that looked like it had been torn from a notebook. Her face was pale as she handed it to me without saying a word. The handwriting was shaky, like someone had written it in a hurry or under stress. It said, "Don't trust the couple upstairs. They're watching you through the cameras. Get out before Sunday service. God help you both." The paper was yellowed around the edges and had what looked like coffee stains, suggesting it had been hidden there for a while. Ashley and I stared at each other, both trying to process what we were reading. My first instinct was to laugh it off as some kind of prank, but the desperation in the handwriting made my stomach churn with unease. We decided to search more thoroughly, and that's when we found them. Dozens of religious pamphlets stuffed between the mattress and box spring, each one more disturbing than the last. They weren't your typical church flyers about Sunday services and community events. These were handmade booklets with titles like "Preparing for the End Times" and "The Chosen Few: Signs of Divine Selection." The pages were filled with rambling text about spiritual warfare, the importance of separating from worldly influences, and something called the gathering that was supposed to happen when true believers received their calling. Mixed in with the pamphlets were more handwritten notes, all in different handwriting styles, as if multiple people had left warnings over time. One note read, "They drugged our tea on the second night. We barely escaped." Another simply said, "Helen watches you sleep." Camera in the smoke detector above the bed. My mouth went dry as I followed the direction of the note and spotted the small, barely visible lens tucked inside what I'd assumed was just a regular smoke detector. Ashley grabbed my arm so hard it hurt, and I could feel her trembling as the reality of our situation began to sink in. We whispered frantically about what to do next, both of us glancing nervously at the smoke detector that now seemed to be staring back at us like a malevolent eye. Ashley wanted to pack up and leave immediately, but I convinced her we needed to be smart about this. If Robert and Helen were really watching us through cameras, sudden packing and fleeing might trigger some kind of confrontation we weren't prepared for. Instead, we decided to act normal while we figured out our next move. We got dressed and went outside, pretending to admire the morning view while actually scanning for more cameras and looking for escape routes. The mountain road we'd driven up was the only way out that we knew of, and it would take us directly past Robert and Helen's cabin. As we stood on the porch trying to look casual, Helen appeared from the direction of their cabin, walking toward us with a wicker basket in her hands and that same unnaturally bright smile from the day before. She was wearing a long flowing dress that seemed more appropriate for a church service than mountain living, and her hair was now elaborately braided with small flowers woven throughout. "Good morning, dear ones," Helen called out in a sing-song voice that made my skin crawl. "I brought you some fresh eggs from our chickens and some of my special herbal tea blend. I thought we might sit and chat about your spiritual journey." She emphasized the words, "spiritual journey," in a way that made them sound less like a casual conversation topic and more like an interrogation. Ashley managed to smile and thank her for the eggs, but I could see the panic in her eyes as Helen invited herself up onto our porch and settled into one of the rocking chairs as if she owned the place. She began asking increasingly personal questions about our beliefs, our families, and whether we'd ever experienced divine revelations or messages from above. When Ashley politely mentioned that we weren't particularly religious, Helen's expression shifted subtly, and I noticed her eyes narrow as she studied us more intently. She started talking about how the mountains were a place of spiritual cleansing, how God brought certain people to this location for a purpose, and how she and Robert had been called to help guide lost souls toward enlightenment. The longer she talked, the more cult-like her language became, and I realized we were being evaluated for something much more sinister than simple religious conversion. Helen finally left after what felt like hours, but not before insisting we join her and Robert for a fellowship dinner that evening. She said it would be a wonderful opportunity to meet some of their other friends who were visiting the area, and that we shouldn't worry about bringing anything because they had everything prepared. The way she said everything prepared sent chills down my spine, especially after reading those warning notes. As soon as she was out of sight, Ashley and I rushed back inside and started planning our escape. We decided to pack quietly and leave through the back of the cabin, hoping to find another way down the mountain through the forest. While Ashley gathered our clothes, I searched online for any information about Robert and Helen Carpenter, but our cell service was still spotty. What little I could find was terrifying. Several missing persons reports from the area over the past 2 years, all involving couples who had rented isolated cabins. The local sheriff's department had investigated but never found any concrete evidence linking the disappearances to specific properties or individuals. One forum post from someone claiming to be a former guest mentioned a doomsday group operating in the Smoky Mountains, targeting vulnerable tourists for recruitment or worse. As we were stuffing our belongings into our bags, we heard footsteps on the gravel outside, followed by multiple voices having a hushed conversation. I crept to the window and saw Robert talking to 3 other men I didn't recognize, all of them dressed in similar flannel shirts and carrying what looked like camping gear. They kept glancing toward our cabin while they talked, and I noticed one of them was holding a clipboard with what appeared to be photos attached to it. Robert pointed in our direction and said something that made the other men nod seriously. One of them walked closer to our cabin and began circling it slowly, as if he was looking for something or checking for potential escape routes. My heart was pounding as I watched him examine the windows and test the back door handle. When he noticed me watching from the window, he didn't look away or act embarrassed. Instead, he smiled and waved like we were old friends. That casual acknowledgement of being caught spying was somehow more terrifying than if he'd tried to hide. I knew then that we were in immediate danger, and that whatever these people had planned, it was going to happen soon. We abandoned any pretense of staying calm and grabbed our essential belongings, leaving most of our stuff behind. Ashley found a window in the back bedroom that faced away from where the men were gathered, and we managed to slip out quietly into the dense forest behind the cabin. The terrain was rough and steep, with thick underbrush that tore at our clothes and made every step treacherous. We had no idea where we were going, but we knew we had to put distance between ourselves and that cabin. After what felt like hours of stumbling through the woods, we finally found an old logging road that led us back toward the main highway. Our phone started getting signal again about a mile from the main road, and I immediately called 911. The dispatcher seemed familiar with the area when I mentioned the Carpenter property, and she told us to stay exactly where we were until a patrol car could reach us. While we waited, Ashley found one more note in her jacket pocket that she'd somehow grabbed during our frantic packing. It was different from the others, written in blue ink on newer paper. It said, "If you're reading this, you got out. Don't let them find you. They have people everywhere. Trust no one who mentions the gathering." The state police arrived within 30 minutes and took our statement, but they explained that without concrete evidence of a crime, they couldn't arrest Robert and Helen. However, they did tell us that our report was the missing piece they'd been looking for in their ongoing investigation into the disappearances. Apparently, multiple law enforcement agencies had been tracking this group for months, suspecting they were using various rental properties to identify and recruit vulnerable individuals for their doomsday cult. The officer mentioned that they'd been waiting for someone to come forward with inside information about the operation. 3 weeks later, we received a call from the detective handling the case. They'd raided the Carpenter property and found evidence of the larger network. Dozens of similar cabins across 3 states, all equipped with hidden cameras and used to evaluate potential recruits. Robert and Helen, along with 8 other cult members, were arrested on charges ranging from unlawful surveillance to kidnapping. The detective told us that our escape and report had likely saved other people from whatever fate awaited those who didn't make it out. We never did find out exactly what happened during those fellowship dinners, or what the ultimate goal of the gathering was supposed to be. And honestly, I'm grateful we never had to find out. Ashley and I still take vacations, but we stick to major hotel chains now, and we always trust our instincts when something doesn't feel right. Five of us from Penn State decided to rent this isolated farmhouse in rural Pennsylvania for a weekend study session. It was early October 2019, and we were all completely fried from midterm prep, living on energy drinks and maybe 3 hours of sleep each night. My roommate Kevin had found the place online, said it would be perfect for getting away from campus distractions and actually focusing on our environmental science coursework. The farmhouse was surrounded by nothing but cornfields and dense woods, exactly the kind of quiet we needed. We loaded up Kevin's beat-up Ford Explorer with enough snacks and coffee to last a week, and made the 2-hour drive out there on a Friday afternoon. The whole ride, we were joking around, playing music, just happy to finally escape the stress of university life for a couple days. The property was at the end of this long gravel driveway, maybe half a mile from the nearest paved road. When we pulled up, the first thing that struck me was how completely silent everything was. No traffic, no construction, no voices from neighboring apartments, just the sound of wind moving through the corn stalks that stretched endlessly in every direction. The farmhouse itself was this weathered 2-story building with a wraparound porch and peeling white paint. It had that authentic rural charm that city kids like us found exciting and slightly intimidating at the same time. We grabbed our bags and headed inside, already planning out which rooms we'd claim and where we'd set up our study stations. The interior was simple but comfortable. Hardwood floors, a stone fireplace, and a kitchen table big enough for all our textbooks and laptops. Perfect for what we needed. Friday evening went exactly as planned. We spread our materials across the kitchen table, ordered pizza from the only place that would deliver out there, and actually managed to get some serious studying done. The silence was incredible. No dorm-mates' music bleeding through thin walls, no parties going on upstairs, no campus security doing their rounds. Just the occasional creak of old wood settling and the distant rustle of corn outside. We stayed up pretty late, fueled by caffeine and the novelty of being somewhere so remote. Around midnight, we finally called it quits and headed to our rooms. I claimed the small bedroom upstairs that faced the back of the property, with windows that looked out over the cornfields. The moon was almost full that night, casting these long shadows across the rows of corn that seemed to shift and dance in the breeze. I remember thinking how peaceful it all looked before I fell asleep. Saturday was perfect. We woke up refreshed for the first time in weeks, made breakfast together, and spent the entire day being productive in ways that seemed impossible back on campus. The weather was crisp and clear, with that perfect autumn light filtering through the kitchen windows. We took breaks to walk around the property, exploring the old barn and the tree line that separated the farmhouse from the deeper woods. There were these massive oak trees that must have been there for decades, their branches reaching out over the corn like protective arms. We even found what looked like an old well, covered with rotting boards and surrounded by overgrown weeds. Everything felt so normal, so peaceful. We grilled burgers for dinner, sat on the porch talking about our plans after graduation, and enjoyed the kind of relaxed evening that reminded us why we'd wanted to get away in the first place. None of us had any idea what was coming. Saturday night started like any other. We were all exhausted from a full day of studying, so we decided to call it early and get some rest. I was in my room by 10:30, reading through some notes one last time before bed. The corn outside my window rustled softly in the evening breeze, and I could hear my friends settling into their rooms. Kevin in the room next to mine, Stephanie and Monica sharing the master bedroom downstairs, and Tyler on the living room couch because he'd lost our rock-paper-scissors tournament. The old farmhouse had its usual collection of settling sounds, but nothing that seemed out of place. I was just starting to drift off when I heard it, a rhythmic banging sound coming from somewhere outside. At first I thought maybe it was a loose shutter or piece of siding hitting against the house in the wind, but the rhythm was too deliberate, too consistent. Bang, 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 pause, bang, 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 pause. I got up and pressed my face against the window, trying to see where the sound was coming from. The moon was bright enough that I could make out the rows of corn stretching away from the house, but the shadows between them were pitch black. The banging continued, and now I could hear what sounded like voices, faint and indistinct, but definitely human. They seemed to be coming from deep within the cornfield, maybe a few hundred yards from the house. I couldn't make out any words, just this low murmur of conversation that would rise and fall between the rhythmic banging. My heart started pounding, but I told myself it was probably just some local kids messing around, maybe having a party or something. Still, the remoteness of the location made it weird. Who would be out there at this hour, and why would they be making so much noise? I listened for maybe 10 minutes, hoping it would stop, but the sounds just kept going. Consistent, deliberate, and definitely not random. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I walked down the hall and knocked softly on Kevin's door. He was still awake, sitting on his bed with his laptop, but when he saw my face, he immediately closed it. "You hear that too?" he whispered, and I nodded. We crept downstairs together, where we found the others already gathered in the living room. Stephanie was peeking out through the front curtains, Monica was sitting on the edge of the couch looking nervous, and Tyler was standing by the fireplace with his arms crossed. "It's been going on for almost 20 minutes, Stephanie said without turning around. "The banging started first, then the voices, and there's definitely more than one person out there." We all stood there listening, and the sounds were even clearer from downstairs. The voices had this weird sing-song quality to them, like they were chanting or reciting something. Every few minutes the banging would stop completely, the voices would get louder, and then it would all start up again. Tyler, who'd always been the most skeptical about anything remotely supernatural, suggested we just ignore it and go back to bed. But none of us could shake the feeling that this wasn't normal teenage behavior. The remoteness of the location, the late hour, the ritualistic nature of the sounds, it all added up to something that made us deeply uncomfortable. We decided to stay downstairs together, taking turns keeping watch at the windows. The sounds continued for another hour, maybe longer, before they finally stopped. The silence that followed was almost more unsettling than the noise had been. We sat there in the dark for what felt like forever, straining to hear anything else. But the night had returned to its usual peaceful quiet. Eventually, exhaustion won out over anxiety, and we all tried to get some sleep. But I kept waking up throughout the night, listening for any sign that the sounds had returned. They never did, but that didn't make me feel any better about what we'd heard. Sunday morning came with bright sunshine and the smell of coffee that Kevin had started brewing early. We were all tired and on edge. But in the daylight, the previous night's events seemed almost dreamlike. Over breakfast, we tried to rationalize what we'd heard. Maybe it was hunters or farmers doing some kind of late-night maintenance, or even just animals making noise that we'd misinterpreted. But Stephanie insisted we should walk out to the cornfield and see if there was any evidence of what had happened. The rest of us weren't thrilled about the idea, but curiosity won out over caution. We finished eating, grabbed some water bottles, and headed outside. The morning air was crisp and clean, and the corn looked completely normal. Just rows and rows of tall stalks swaying gently in the breeze. We walked along the edge of the field, following roughly the direction where we thought the sounds had been coming from. What we found near the tree line made all of us stop dead in our tracks. There, arranged in perfect circles, were these crude wooden symbols. Maybe a dozen of them total, each one about the size of a dinner plate. They looked like they'd been hastily carved from branches or pieces of driftwood, with rough edges and splinters sticking out in all directions. The symbols themselves were hard to describe. Some looked like twisted crosses, others like interlocking triangles, and a few had these strange curved lines that reminded me of horns or claws. They were arranged in 3 separate circles, each about 10 feet in diameter, positioned maybe 30 yards apart from each other. The grass around each circle was trampled flat, and there were clear footprints in the soft earth, at least 4 or 5 different sets of boots, all adult-sized. But what really got our attention were the tire tracks leading from the circles back toward the main road. Deep, fresh grooves in the dirt that definitely hadn't been there when we'd arrived on Friday. We stood there staring at the symbols for maybe 10 minutes, nobody saying much of anything. Monica took some photos with her phone, though I'm not sure why. It's not like we were going to post them on social media or anything. Tyler picked up one of the wooden pieces and examined it closely. The carving was rough but deliberate, with deep gouges that looked like they'd been made with a knife or maybe a chisel. "This isn't random," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "Someone spent time making these." Kevin was following the tire tracks with his eyes, tracing their path back through the corn toward the road. "They drove right up to the field," he said. "Multiple vehicles, looks like, and they knew exactly where they were going." The implications were starting to sink in. This wasn't some spontaneous teenage prank. This was organized, planned, and it had happened while we were sleeping just a few hundred yards away. That's when we decided we'd had enough. We gathered up all the wooden symbols, I still don't know why we did that, maybe some instinct to remove the evidence, and threw them in a garbage bag. Then we packed up our stuff as quickly as possible and got out of there. The drive back to campus was mostly silent, all of us lost in our own thoughts about what we'd experienced. We never reported it to anyone, and we never talked about it much after that weekend. But sometimes, when I'm lying in bed at night, I still think about those symbols and wonder what kind of ritual we'd stumbled into. The strangest part is that when I looked up the property online a few weeks later, I found out it had been sold just 3 days after our weekend there. The listing mentioned that the previous owners had been trying to sell for over a year without any luck. Makes you wonder if we weren't the first guests to have that kind of experience out there. I needed a break from everything. Life had been this constant blur of deadlines and stress, and when my sister offered to watch my dog for a week so I could take my son on a quick getaway, I jumped on Airbnb and booked the first decent-looking place I found near Missoula. It was a small cabin tucked back off a dirt road, surrounded by tall pine trees and not much else. The photos showed a cozy wooden structure with a fireplace, an old rocking chair on the porch, and wide windows that looked out into nothing but forest. It seemed perfect. Quiet, disconnected, exactly what I needed. The drive out there was long, and by the time we arrived, the sun was starting to dip behind the trees. My son, Max, who's 9, was excited by how spooky the trees looked. The cabin had that musty old wood smell when we walked in, the kind that sticks to your clothes a little. I checked the windows out of habit and noticed a few were open, just slightly, like someone had propped them to air the place out. I didn't think much of it at the time. I closed each one and double-checked the latches, especially in the bedroom and the tiny kitchen nook. Then we headed back into town to grab dinner before it got too dark to drive. We were gone maybe 2 hours. The place we ate at wasn't anything special, but the people were friendly and Max got a free scoop of ice cream, which made his night. When we got back to the cabin, the porch light was on, casting these long shadows across the steps. It felt colder than earlier, even though the weather app on my phone said it hadn't dropped much. Inside, something felt different. I couldn't put my finger on it right away. Just this stillness, like the kind of quiet you notice only after being around noise. I went to check the bedroom, and that's when I saw the window by the bed cracked open, just like earlier. Except this time, I knew for sure I had latched it. I walked through the whole place again. Every single window I had shut was now open by maybe 2 inches. Same exact angle, same direction. Max followed behind me, asking if it was supposed to be like that, and I just said something vague about the wind. Truth is, it made no sense. The windows weren't loose. The latches were the old metal hook style, the kind you have to physically unhook. It wasn't the kind of thing that just slips open. I texted the host just to let them know, and their reply came a few minutes later. Yeah, the wind can be weird out there sometimes. Nothing to worry about. That smiley face bothered me more than it should have. I tried to brush it off. We locked everything up again. This time I double-checked the front and back doors too, and settled in for the night. Max fell asleep fast, like always, curled up in his sleeping bag on the couch with his tablet still playing some YouTube video at low volume. I stayed up a little longer, sitting by the small fireplace with a mug of tea, trying to relax. But my eyes kept drifting to the windows. I couldn't shake the idea that someone had been inside while we were gone. Not robbed, not vandalized, just inside. Around 11, I turned everything off and headed to the bedroom. I left the hallway light on, cracked the door just enough so I could still hear Max if he got up. The bed creaked in that old cabin way when I lay down. I was just starting to doze when I heard it. This soft creak, not from the house, but outside. I sat up, held my breath, and listened. Another creak, then a slow, dragging sound, like something moving across the porch. I got out of bed carefully, not turning on any lights, and made my way to the window that faced the back of the cabin. At first, I didn't see anything. Just trees and darkness and the faint orange glow from the hallway behind me. But as my eyes adjusted, I saw something at the tree line. Tall, not moving, just standing there, barely visible between the trunks. I thought maybe it was a post or a branch, but the longer I stared, the more it looked like a person. Whoever it was, they were facing the cabin. I couldn't make out a face or clothes, just the outline, unmoving. My first instinct was to wake Max and get in the car, but I didn't want to panic him unless I was sure. So I backed away from the window and grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen drawer. I stepped outside as quietly as I could, heart pounding, flashlight gripped so tight my fingers hurt. The cold hit instantly, sharper than I expected, and the porch groaned beneath me as I took a few steps forward. I scanned the trees. Nothing. Just stillness and dark shapes. I aimed the light toward where I had seen the figure, but the beam didn't reach far enough. I clicked it off and stood there listening. No footsteps, no animals, no wind. Just the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. And then I noticed something weird. The rocking chair on the porch, the one I'd seen in the listing photos, was tilted back slightly, like someone had just gotten up from it. I went back inside, locked the door, and slid one of the kitchen chairs in front of it. more for my own peace of mind than anything else. I didn't go back to sleep, just sat on the edge of the bed, every light in the cabin on now, staring at the floor. Around 2 a.m., I thought I heard footsteps on the gravel path that led around the side of the cabin, slow and deliberate. But when I peeked out, there was nothing. No figure, no movement. At some point, Max got up to use the bathroom and asked why all the lights were on. I told him I just couldn't sleep. He shrugged and went right back to the couch. I don't think he ever knew anything was wrong. As soon as the sky started to lighten, that pale gray blue before sunrise, I packed our bags without even changing out of my pajamas. I didn't care if we left early. I just needed to be somewhere that didn't feel like it was watching me back. When I opened the door to load our stuff into the car, I noticed something that made my chest go tight. In the dirt near the porch steps, right next to the wood pile, there were boot prints. Not ours. Too large for Max, wrong tread for my sneakers. They circled around the back of the cabin and disappeared into the trees. I didn't follow them. I never left a review. Never reported it. When the host messaged me later asking if everything was okay, I replied with a quick, "All good, thanks." I didn't want to open a conversation. Maybe that sounds paranoid, but something about the whole thing felt like it wasn't supposed to be explained. Like the more I thought about it, the more real it became. I couldn't prove anything had happened, technically. Nothing was stolen, no one was hurt. But every instinct I had told me we had been watched, not just that night, but maybe from the moment we arrived. I've stayed in a dozen other Airbnbs since then, but I never booked another one in the woods. I stick to places in town now, places with neighbors and streetlights and Wi-Fi that actually works. And even now, years later, every time I check into a new place, the first thing I do is walk room to room and test every window. Not just to see if they close, but to see if they stay that way. The casita looked almost too perfect when I pulled into the driveway that afternoon. Tucked behind a tan adobe-style house on the outskirts of Albuquerque, it had this sunlit charm that made it feel more like a weekend escape than a work stop. I was there for a few days to film aerial B-roll of desert ridgelines and abandoned motels for a travel series I'd been freelancing on. The host, a friendly older woman named Diane, met me at the side gate and walked me to the casita like I was family. She pointed out the big windows, the porch light that came on automatically at dusk, and the fenced yard, which she said was completely private. You'll barely hear a coyote. It felt safe, almost too quiet, but I figured that was the whole point. Inside, the place was small but comfortable. Open studio layout, a kitchenette in the corner, a queen bed under one of those enormous windows Diane had bragged about. The glass stretched almost floor to ceiling, and yeah, the view was nice. Scrubby bushes, a couple of trees clinging to life in the sandy yard, and a weathered fence at the far edge. But there were no curtains. None. Diane said the previous guests liked waking up to the sun and that no one can see you anyway. I didn't push back. I've stayed in worse setups, motels with roaches and one terrifying night in a converted storage unit in Utah. This place was a step up, or so I thought. That first night was uneventful. I dumped my gear, reviewed some clips on my laptop, ate a gas station sandwich, and passed out early. The second day, I was out from sunrise to late afternoon, flying my drone through desert winds and losing 3 batteries to bad timing. I came back dusty and sunburned, but happy with the footage. I dropped everything on the table and started importing files while the auto porch light blinked on outside. Just as I clicked into the first batch of clips, something subtle made me pause. Not a sound exactly, more like a shift in the light. I glanced toward the window and saw nothing at first, just the faint outline of the trees. Then a shape. Still. Too still. There was a man. He was standing near the back fence, half in shadow, not moving, not shifting his weight, not doing anything a person normally does when they're just passing through. He was just there. The light from the porch didn't quite reach him, but I could make out that he was wearing something dark, maybe a hoodie or a jacket, and his arms hung at his sides like he didn't know what to do with them. For a few long seconds, I didn't do anything. I just watched him. He didn't wave, didn't call out, didn't move closer. I stood up fast enough to knock my chair back, yanked the door open, and stepped out onto the porch. But the yard was empty. Just breeze and sand and the low creak of a tree swaying near the fence. I walked the length of the yard, all the way to the fence, half expecting to find footprints or a broken plank, anything that might make this make sense. But there was nothing. The sand was undisturbed, the gate still latched from the inside. I even checked the far corners with my phone flashlight, but the whole space was empty. I told myself it could have been a trick of the light, maybe even a neighbor's silhouette behind the fence, though I hadn't seen any houses nearby when I flew the drone earlier. Still, I didn't sleep much that night. Every gust of wind that rustled the bushes sent me glancing toward the window, expecting that figure to be back. By morning, I tried to brush it off. I had footage to sort through and edits to make, and deadlines don't care if you had a weird night. I opened the laptop, grabbed an energy drink from the fridge, and sat back down to review the drone clips from the previous day. Most of it was landscape stuff, dry washes, empty gas stations, one shot where a jackrabbit darted between two boulders. But around the third file, when the drone had done a slow pan across the ridge and turned back toward the neighborhood where I was staying, I noticed something that made my scalp tighten. Behind the wooden fence that bordered Diane's yard, just barely visible in the far edge of the frame, was a figure, a man, standing there, again. I scrubbed back and forth in the timeline, zooming in as much as I could without blowing out the pixels. He was just standing behind the fence, facing the casita. I hadn't seen him while I was flying, which made sense. I'd been watching the monitor, not the yard, but the camera had caught him. In another clip a few minutes later, he was still there, only in a slightly different spot. Still behind the fence, still staring straight ahead, no movement, no obvious reason for him to be there. And what chilled me more than anything was that it wasn't one accidental frame. He was visible in 4 different clips, always in the background, never walking, just standing there like he'd been waiting for something. At that point, I took a screenshot and went to show Diane. She was out in her garden, pruning some lavender, and when I asked if anyone else had access to the yard, or if there were neighbors directly behind the fence, her demeanor shifted. She stopped trimming and looked at me like I'd said something completely unexpected. "There's no house back there," she said. "Just state land, dirt, brush, a couple of coyotes. Why?" I hesitated for a second, then showed her the photo on my phone. Her eyes narrowed, but she didn't say anything for a moment. Then she handed the phone back and said, "You sure that's not just a shadow or something from the drone?" Her tone was polite, but it had that edge people get when they're trying not to panic you, or themselves. I didn't argue with her. There was something in the way she looked back toward the fence. Not fear, exactly, but a kind of hesitation, like she'd already decided not to dig too deep. I went back to the casita and closed the laptop. That night, I moved the small table in front of the window and propped my backpack against the lower part of the glass, just enough to block the view from outside without making it obvious. I left one of my cameras recording through the night, pointed at the yard just in case. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to a faint metallic sound. Not loud, more like the soft clink of metal brushing metal. I held my breath and stayed still, listening. It didn't come again. In the morning, I checked the footage. For the first few hours, it was nothing but insects and the occasional breeze. But just after 3 a.m., the camera picked up something. A dark figure moved near the edge of the frame, low and fast, not like a person walking, more like someone ducking. The motion was quick, but it was there. What bothered me most was the placement. The figure had been on my side of the fence, not behind it, not outside, inside the yard. I packed my gear by noon, told Diane I had an early call back in Flagstaff. She didn't ask questions, just wished me a safe trip and said to leave the key under the pot by the door. I didn't end up using any of the drone footage from that trip. Every time I opened those files, I felt like I was inviting something back into my space. I don't know who that man was or how he got into the yard without leaving a trace, or how long he'd been watching. And I'm not proud of it, but I didn't report anything to the police. What would I say? That I saw a man in the background of my own videos? That my host gave me a strange look and then pretended everything was fine? I don't have any proof he did anything, but I also know what I saw, and I know what my camera recorded. That trip changed the way I work. I never stay in backyard casitas anymore, no matter how well-reviewed they are. I carry blackout window film in my suitcase now, and I've stopped flying my drone near places where I sleep. There's this part of me that wonders if Diane had seen him before, if she knew something and just didn't want to deal with it, or maybe she didn't want to scare guests. Either way, I haven't gone back to Albuquerque, not even to drive through. And I still have that folder on my hard drive, labeled NM footage. I haven't opened it in months, but I haven't deleted it either.